In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the short block on a Troy-Bilt backpack blower. The short block is the central core of your engine. It typically consists of the crankcase, the piston, the cylinder, and in the case of a 4-cycle engine, the valve train. Replacing the short block would usually be due to a catastrophic failure, such as running the engine out of oil and having the engine seize, or maybe a broken connecting rod. Replacing the short block would be considered an advanced repair. But if you've done some repairs in the past and have a little experience, along with our step-by-step video, this is a repair you should be able to do yourself. The harness is secured to the blower with 4 nuts. We'll go ahead and remove those. Now I can pull the harness away from the blower. Now I'm going to remove 1/2 of the impeller housing assembly. It's held in place with a series of screws. Now I have access to the impeller and I can remove it. It's held in place with 4 screws. Now I can remove the other half of the impeller housing assembly. It's secured to the rest of the blower with 4 screws on this side of the housing and 3 on the other side. Now I'll remove the carburetor. First I'll remove the air filter cover and the air filter, and next the air filter base. Now I need to remove the throttle cable from this side of the engine. It's held in place with a clip. If I put a screwdriver behind that clip, I can pry it away from the engine. With the carburetor and throttle cable removed, now I can remove the wiring harness from the ignition coil, and that'll free the rear impeller housing and the blower tube from the rest of the engine. At this point, the engine is free from the base and fuel tank, so I'll just lift the engine away from the base. Now we can remove the ignition coil. I'll pull the spark plug wire away from the plug and remove the other screw securing the ignition coil. Back on the carburetor side, I'll remove the heat shield and the carburetor isolator. And now I'll just remove the crankcase breather hose. Now I'll remove the muffler. Now we can remove the starter pawls as well as the flywheel. But to do that, we need to seize up the piston. Otherwise, when we go to remove these pieces, the engine will just rotate. I'll seize the engine and stop the rotation by inserting a short piece of rope through the spark plug hole. That'll make it so the piston can't move, and therefore we'll be able to remove the other pieces. So I'll remove the spark plug, and then insert my piece of rope into the cylinder. And now when we go to remove the fasteners on those other pieces, the engine won't be able to rotate. Now we can remove the starter pawls. The starter pawls are held to the engine with this nut. This coupling is threaded on in front of the nut. So first we'll remove the coupling. To do that, I'll use a good pair of pliers. And now I can remove the starter pawls with my ratchet wrench. Now I can remove the flywheel. The flywheel is held in place with a nut. Oftentimes the flywheel will simply pull away from the engine. But if it doesn't, such as in this case, a tip you can use is to partially thread the nut back onto the engine shaft. You don't want to thread it on all the way. You don't want the shaft to be exposed past the face of the nut. With it threaded on, pull on the flywheel and strike the nut lightly with a hammer. And that'll free the flywheel. Here I have the new short block. You'll see that the short block includes a new spark plug as well as the oil filler neck and cap. To reinstall our parts on the new short block, we need to go ahead and re-seize the piston. So again, I'll remove the spark plug. And insert the rope into the cylinder. Now I'll install the flywheel. You'll notice that the flywheel has a keyway for the shaft. There's a Woodruff key on the shaft. I'll line those two up and then secure it with the nut. We'll want to use a little bit of Loctite here. Now I'll thread the starter pawls back onto the engine. And again, I'll want to use a little bit of Loctite on the coupling. Now I can remove the rope from the cylinder and reinstall the spark plug. Now we can install the muffler, starting with a new muffler gasket, and then I'll secure the muffler with the screws. Now I'll reinstall the crankcase breather hose. Now we'll reinstall the carburetor isolator. I'll insert the screws through the isolator, attach a new gasket, and apply a little bit of Loctite to these two screws. Now I can thread this assembly back onto the engine. Now we can begin reattaching the blower components to the main engine assembly. I'll just place the engine back onto the base. Now I'll go ahead and replace the ignition coil. I've rotated the magnets on the flywheel to their top position. And I'll align the magnets with the two posts on the ignition coil. For now, I'll just loosely install the screws that hold the ignition coil to the motor. One of those screws secures the grounding wire from the wiring harness. With it loosely attached to the motor, now I'm going to use an ignition coil gapping tool. This sets an air gap between the coil and the flywheel of 0.014 of an inch. If you don't have one of these tools, you can usually get away with just using a thick business card. So I'll lift the coil up and slide the gapping coil between the magnets and the post. Then I'll let the coil rest on the magnets and tighten up the screws. Now I'll remove the gapping tool. Now I'll just reinstall the other wire from our wiring harness and reinstall the spark plug wire. Now I'll just go ahead and thread the heat shield back up against the engine. This is on the carburetor side. And I'll snap the throttle cable back onto the side of the engine. There's a slot on the carburetor isolator that holds the ignition wire. I'll just slide the wire back into that slot and line it up with the slot on the heat shield. Now I can go ahead and reinstall the carburetor and the air cleaner base. First, I'll thread the throttle cable through the hole in the carburetor, and I'll reattach the carburetor or the air cleaner base to the carb and the carburetor isolator, securing the carburetor back to the engine. I'll reinstall the air filter and the air filter cover. Now I'll reinstall the engine cover. Now I'll begin resecuring the impeller housing back to the motor. Now I can reinstall the 4 screws on the inside of the impeller housing. I'll want to put a little bit of Loctite on these screws. Now I can install the impeller. I'll want to use a little bit of Loctite on these screws. Now realign the hose with the impeller housing and reinstall the opposite side of the housing. And now secure the housing with the screws. And we'll finish up by reinstalling the harness.